Ali, I just noticed that your bookshelf is vaguely color coded.
It is. Thank you for noticing. That
It's
takes a
very
lot of
cool.
hard
It's
work.
very cool.
Kind of got green, then I've got the oranges and then the
Now I just want to buy
yellows.
you a bunch of yellow books.
Yeah.
I don't care what it even says. Could be conspiracy theories. Just need to have a yellow cover.
And I've got the aquas here. Yeah. No, I worked hard on that. Thank you for noticing.
Nice.
Nice, nice.
Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Pros and Cons, the podcast where sometimes we feel like pros and sometimes we feel like cons. Today, I'm your host, James Healy, and I'm joined by Burnham.
Hello. I am a screenwriter and writer of prose. I work as a creative producer at Westwards, which is a literary development organization. That means I create writing programs for emerging writers. I host writing workshops. And kind of, I've got a lot of fingers in different pies with that kind of learning about the publishing industry and yeah, that's me.
Excellent. And also joining me today is Matan Elul.
Hi, my name is Matan. I'm an English teacher. I'm also a writer. I like to write horror and fantasy. And yeah, on the side, I also do some editing. So if you have any grammar questions.
Excellent. We'll definitely be touching on grammar today. So today's subject is taking artistic risks or writing without concern. And before I jump into that, I'd like to ask both of you, what have you been reading and what have you been consuming at the moment or this last week or so?
Hmm. Yeah, I can mention it. I can't remember if I've talked about The Bear before, the TV show on I
Nice.
believe it's Netflix. But yeah, recently
Amazon, I
finished
think.
Amazon. Okay, sorry, I
Yeah.
won't give it Netflix the credit. It's Amazon that has produced this. Yeah, no, I finished binging the latest season, which is season 3. And look, it's just really incredible television. It's a show. It's interesting that we are talking about shows that we're talking about books and writing that does things that are against the grain and take artistic risks, because I definitely think The Bear does that. It has this individual approach to each episode where it just wants to it'll explore a singular theme each episode, and it'll do it through montage. And sometimes there's whole episodes. There was one glorious episode this season that was almost entirely told through montage. So it wasn't
Nice.
a typical scene by scene narrative structure that we're used to. And just the cinematography is beautiful. And taking cinematographic, yeah, that's a word, risk narrative risks. So yeah, just praising The Bear. We're gonna get another season. And yeah, check it out if you haven't.
Very
Very
nice.
cool.
Um, did you guys ever come late to a party and discovered something that everybody else already knew is really cool?
Yeah, that
Yes.
happened. Yes.
So, guys, seriously, Jane Austen, what the hell? How can you be so good so long ago? Seriously, I've been reading Pride and Prejudice, and holy
How
moly,
good is
this
it?
this stuff is good. Um, is this
And
the
it's
equivalent of me
funny.
becoming a Swiftie? I don't know, but it's really nice. I'm loving this. Jane Austen.
I'm so excited for you to be on your Jane Austen wave. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been reading, I've got about 3 or 4 books about gladiators. So I'm just done a
Ah,
ton of reading
nice.
into
Deep in the
gladiators at the
research.
moment. Yeah, a
Nice.
bit of research.
Oh, look at
One I
that.
find it particularly interesting is Gladiator, the Roman fighters' unofficial manual, which sort of just discusses becoming a gladiator from the perspective of like set as if the book was written. Sorry, it's written as if we were in kind of like 100 AD Rome.
Wow.
And it's kind of like a manual too. If you wanted to take this up tomorrow, these are the reasons that you might do it.
Step by
This is
step
what you can
instructions.
expect. This is the kind of training you can expect and stuff. And it's quite funny and quite witty. And yeah, it kind of just gives the full sweep, the full gamut of gladiator life, and really gets in detail into the various fighting styles and tactics and lifestyles and social dynamics and everything of the
Nice. Very
gladiator
cool.
schools and stuff. So I found that one of the most informative. If
James,
anyone's interested in reading in gladiators.
I don't know if the listeners know, but aren't you like an MMA fighter on the side? Aren't you something of a gladiator?
No, I used to do a bit of Muay Thai.
Muay Thai,
Kind of getting
sorry.
back into it again. But yeah, I did Muay Thai when I was over in Sydney. So I definitely did. I did a few competitions and I did a few tournaments. So I'm kind of employing a little bit of research and a little bit of like personal knowledge
Yeah,
into
you've
writing
got
the
some.
short story that I'm writing at the moment. Yeah.
Did you ever turn to the crowd and ask them, "Are you not entertained?" Or did you never have the opportunity to do that?
Never quite had the opportunity to do that. You kind of couldn't take your
Never
eyes
say
off.
never.
Couldn't take your eyes off the
Sounds like a really good way to lose and get hit.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's quite a big green light if the other guy turns around and starts
yeah.
showboating. Yeah.
You're practically asking for that chip shot.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to jump into our topic for today by reading a quick quote. So this is an extract from the foreword from John Connolly's first novel, Every Dead Thing, which went on to kind of launch his Charlie Parker series, which he's written at least a dozen books on, and then 2 or 3 spin-offs as well. So the quote goes, he had nearly finished a book and he was kind of starting to send the first 3 chapters out to publishers to try to get a bit of positive response back. And this is what he got back. I received a steady trickle of rejections, some of them quite emphatic. One editor even scribbled a note at the end of her publishing house's standard rejection letter to tell me how much she hated the book. In a strange way,
Wow.
the early rejection of the book by multiple publishers was the best thing that could have happened to me. With no expectations, no financial hold over my work, and no obligations to editors, I was free to write a novel that was structurally odd, cross genres, but no concern for entrenched opinion or possible commercial appeal. Had a pair of gay criminals as its only models for success in love and life, and revolved around a central character who was violent, haunted, and perhaps even maddened by grief and loss. The money would have still been nice, though. So I always remember that from having read John Connolly when I was quite young. It's just been a very good example, of writing something that maybe was a bit risky, or maybe it was something that went kind of against conventions or kind of cultural norms, or took some chances, and ended up paying off, despite, I guess, people in the industry having said, we don't like this isn't going to work, this isn't the way to go. And I kind of feel like that's something that certainly I've always felt a little bit of tension within my own work, that maybe I'm writing something that is a bit too different and not for the right reasons, or sometimes I'm leaning into writing something that might seem a little bit more safe, a little bit more conventional, but then I kind of stop and ask myself, what is the point of this as well? What I wanted to kind of ask you guys, in general, like, do you find within your own work, do you ever find yourselves kind of coming across that same friction and that same question of finding yourselves asking, am I taking too many artistic risks, or am I not taking enough?
It's such a good question. And it's one I actually talk about a lot in my day job. So for a bit of context, Westwards is not many not-for-profit publishers. And I guess what we can do as opposed to commercial publishers is we're not driven by, the commercial imperative. So what a commercial publisher looks to do, especially, the manuscripts they will pull out of the slush pile, the manuscripts they will greenlit, have to already kind of fit the molds they've established that can reach their pre-existing audience, so they know, look, we can sell it, and they want works that are wide, can reach the biggest audience, and that's just business sense. That inside the publisher, when they're around the table pitching it at acquisitions, it's got to impress their sales team. At the end of the day, the sales team, even if a publisher loves it, as in the individual publisher who's picked it out of the pile and wants to champion it, if the sales team goes, look, we don't think we can sell it, we don't know how we can market this, That's where a book can fall down at acquisitions if it doesn't meet that commercial imperative. Or what sometimes a publisher might do is be like, hey, look, I think I can get this across the line for you if you make XYZ changes. And that feedback is it's commercial feedback. It's audience-driven feedback. They know it's worked before previously, so that's why they give the feedback, and that's how they're shaping the work, not necessarily to make the work, quote unquote, the best version it can possibly be. They're shaping it into a commercial product. So there's a few other non-for-profit publishers out there, and I guess the thing that differentiates what we do is when we give notes on a book, it's to attempt to turn it into the best possible version it can be. We don't have that commercial imperative to change an author's voice. It's if we can already see they're trying to do something artistic or creatively different, the feedback we would give in-house as the editors, as the publisher, is to try and push it in that direction to make it the best version it can be. Perhaps we're thinking as a publisher, like, hey, if this can win some awards, that'll be good for us as a publisher. That's how we might move books. But it's not necessarily, it doesn't need to be wide. It doesn't need to reach a massive audience for it to win awards. It's just got to be good to win awards. So it is something quite interesting. We talk about it at work a lot because we're also a developer, as in emerging writers come to us to just get mentorship and improve their writing. And we have great success stories where the writers are like, hey, I've got an agent looking at my manuscript. And that's really good. And we say yes, because an agent will advocate for a writer. But at the same time, and the feedback an agent will give is commercial feedback. They will want to turn it into something that they know they can sell to a publisher. So it's just very recently been on my mind that there is, when you're getting feedback, you're like, oh, well, where's it coming from? Is it to turn it into something commercial, which usually means something that is less controversial in the themes, something that is a bit more, has been done before, I guess. It's risk aversion. It's like, oh, well, maybe if you just made the structure a bit more palatable or something. Predictable is not the right word, but safe in the sense that you're not going to surprise your reader suddenly. They're not going to feel alienated, say, if you've picked a different structure. So that's what I mean when I say commercial feedback, as opposed to if a writer is genuinely trying to do something different and unique. We do want to like encourage that to make it just crisp and sharp, but not necessarily change that. Sorry, that was a very long answer to what you asked, James. That's but I do like this, that there is this alternate option out there for people being like, trying to like, oh, do I have to change my work to make it commercial to get to a publisher? I would say there are actually not-for-profit publishers out there that have a slightly different lens on your work.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's really good to know, and a great alternate attitude as well.
Ali touched on a lot of really important things here. I feel like you took us behind the curtain to like see what happens in the background. I'll try to zoom in on what the writer might go through. And first, I kind of want to maybe distinguish between two types, as I see it, of taking risks and being different. The obvious one is the risk you take with your content, with what actually happens inside your story. The villain is actually the hero. The romantic couple doesn't actually get together. Subversions of the genres, subversions of the expectations. A good example is George Martin using F-bombs in fantasy settings. That's kind of a risk. We take it for granted now, but for people who have grown up reading Tolkien and Sword of Shannara or whatever, this was quite surprising. And that was a risk taken with the content. Another form of risk, and a form of risk and creativity that I find tremendously more dangerous, is the changes to the form of the writing. This can be as simple as second person telling of the story, multiple point of views, even pronouns. I'll give an example. Claudia Rankine in her book Citizen, which is about the experiences of Black Americans and racism. She writes a lot of short stories, and a lot of the time she writes them using you. She writes a story about her experience and the experience of her community, but she uses you so that the story doesn't feel like this is what we're going through. This is what all of us are going through. You might not be going through it, but you're also going through it, which I thought was tremendously effective, but that's quite a risk because it's not the way people are used to experiencing these kind of stories. Jennifer Egan, a very good writer, also writes, like modern literature. She also uses you, and she uses different tenses. She would go to the future and the past and kind of play with the form of the writing. In our genre, in speculative fiction, you can also do really cool things with it. I want to shout out N.K. Jemisin. I hope I'm saying the name correctly.
Yes.
The fifth,
Yeah.
am I saying it correctly? The fifth
Yeah,
season.
yep.
I'm not
Yep.
going to spoil too much, but spoiler alert for a really good book, the fifth season, in 3, 2, 1. Jemisin, what she does is that she has 3 characters, 3 point of views. You got a middle-aged woman, you got a young woman, and a little girl. Spoiler alert number 2. At the end of the book, you realize they're all the same character. That's a really huge risk. You think you're reading 3 characters, you actually reading 1. There's an even bigger risk she takes with the 3rd book. I'm not even going to dare touch that. I'm going to give people a chance to find out. But that's the change you can take to the form. So think about it. You can take risks to the content, which is subversion of the genre, and you can take risks to the form, which is a lot more dangerous because when you subvert the genre, maybe you've already hooked your reader by the time they realize something's fishy. But when you subvert the form, usually very quickly they realize, ooh, something in that first page or second page feels a bit different than other books. Am I going to give it a chance? So yeah, different levels of risks, I would say.
And I will add on to that I think commercial publishers are much more willing to take risks on content, as you're saying. I think that they can even sell the controversy of, oh, this person's writing this taboo topic, or they're subverting this. Like they can turn that into a selling point, while the risk of something that's doing something interesting with form, I think that's where they're much more likely to be risk averse.
Brilliant. I have an example here in terms of language and in terms of kind of, I guess, like the prose being kind of against convention and against what is normal. This is a poem, Matan, that you sent me by Lyndon Johnson, called "If I Was a Tap-Natch Poet." And what he's done in this is that he's kind of written it in, what would I call it?
It's called Creole, I believe, which is like
Creole,
nation language.
Yeah, it's kind of written like phonetically. So I'm not going to read too much of it because I'm definitely going to bastardize it. But if I was a tap-natch poet like Chris Okigaboo, Derek Walcott, or T.S. Eliot, I would write a poem so damn deep that it bittersweet, like a precious memory. We make you weep, we make you feel incomplete. And the whole poem is written like that, where it's just kind of like little segments of, just very phonetic and very kind of within that voice or within that accent. And there's also Huckleberry Finn, Matan, as you were mentioning, which is kind of written in kind of, there's a lot of misspellings and stuff written in how that is written as well.
That's a good example of first page. You realize, okay, what's happening here?
Yeah, very strange. I also remember Cormac McCarthy often writes abandoning quotation and a kind of abandoning structure. The page can be all put together. And even in the first page of Prophet Song by Lynch, what was his name? Paul Lynch. One of the first lines of that is like, it's grammatically incorrect because it's just kind of free association, kind of stream of consciousness, one thought flowing into the next. So that can be, that's a style of writing that can often be, like we see it in kind of these great examples of stuff that can be really, really effective. But then at the same time, it also has the risk of possibly being a little bit inaccessible or maybe even a little bit alienating and kind of putting off some readers. So I was wondering if you guys can think of any examples of kind of changes or kind of taking risks with prose in kind of works that you really liked, or if there's any examples that you came across where you personally didn't like them.
I think that I just want to say that in Huckleberry Finn, that was a big barrier for me when I first read it because it kind of bothered me that it had all these spelling mistakes. And he started the book by saying, "Oh, you must have read the book about me written by this guy, Tom Sawyer." And I think when this was written, it was a novelty and it was really cool. But maybe my jaded millennial eyes were like, "Oh man, you're really gonna do that?" But again, I think that it all depends on what we've already seen and what
Yeah.
feels fresh to us. And ironically, something that felt very fresh to me, even though it's old, is Animal Farm. I mean, it's not new at all, but the idea of presenting allegory using what you would expect to be the settings of a children's story, like Charlotte's Web or something. I thought that's a very nice creative content risk. And it really worked for me because it's almost like this is going to sound bad when you ask children to tell you what's wrong using dolls. Okay, that's really dark, but that's kind of what Orwell does with Animal Farm. He's showing you using cute animals what's wrong with society, and that really worked for me as far as subverting what you'd expect.
Yeah, as for language, I can't think of any examples immediately off the top of my head, but I know it's something that I've thought about when writing The Swallow, aka Cypress, just in terms of characters that have accents, and where there's both Scottish and Irish accents. Otherwise, the rest of the characters are British, but lower society Brits. And I have a POV character who would be the lower class Brit. So from his perspective, therefore, Scottish and Irish accents would sound different. So there's the opportunity to represent phonetically how some words are said in that accent on the page. And it is the line between, well, how far do you go where either you're just writing a parody and it's just insulting and it's just cartoony, or visibly looking at it on the page, is it annoying to see like the commas where there's dropped syllables? Like even the Australian accent, we don't pronounce words fully or all the way. So if we were to write a lot of our words down phonetically, there would be dropped letters. So it is just that creative exercise of, well, I want to hint that this person's accent is different to the main characters. And there's some flavor there, and also into the setting and the time period. So it, in a positive way, feeding into that atmosphere, but then where's the line of, not making it annoying, tropish, and alienating to the reader. So that's been a fun exercise within what I'm doing, and I guess how I've mechanically tried to solve it is almost writing a mini dictionary to myself, being like, these words I will use an apostrophe for, these words I won't. And then just being consistent all the way through. There's a lot of Control F there, so it's like I just set my own rules, being like, all right, this word when it's used, I will stylize it, but not this word. So then I don't have like a full sentence that looks like it's been completely like barbarized on the page.
Ali, do you maybe remember the character from, I think it's Wise Man's Fear? It could be Name of the Wind by Rothfuss. Like this secluded farmer guy maybe speaks in a really unreadable manner. And I think even Rothfuss has commented on that in an interview. Maybe James, maybe you've heard of it. He says, like, looking back, I probably shouldn't have written the character that way. Like, it was really over the top. You could tell that the writer was like in his room with Excel spreadsheets trying to make sense of this senseless language that he crafted for that character, of that accent. And it's kind of used for comic relief, where the protagonist kind of learns how to talk that language with him. Do you remember? Like, he kind of answers him, and I'm just sitting there reading about two characters who speak, and I have no idea what either of them is saying. And I think that's
you're right.
You remember
it is a comedy device, so you need to be careful with it, because you've just reminded me I do the same thing. I have these two characters trying to learn a Boston accent in a single night, and I'm making
the Matt
fun
Damon
of them.
fanfic, maybe, possibly, no.
But it is, I use it as a comedy beat, where how I've written it on the page is phonetically spelling those words out, and the characters being like that. this is a dumb accent. I've just remembered another book where I hated this technique. They're an Australian author, so I need to be careful. The delightful Kate Forsyth, and it's one of her very early books. So I guess that's why we can. I've seen in interviews where she said, "I don't regret this stylistic decision I made," so she stands by it. But it absolutely drove me nuts. Which book? I can't find it. It's one of her very early one. It's The Witches of something. The Witches of.
I've definitely seen her in bookstores, I think.
Yeah, we might have to put this in the show notes. It's the
The
one.
Witches of Alienan, maybe?
That could be it. Yeah, that's it. Witches of Alienan. There we go. For Alienan. Alien. I can't even say it. But yes, that's the one. And she, I believe it's a Scottish accent. She's decided to write the entire prose in. So it's this that I'm describing, but it's not just the dialogue, like it's the whole thing, because she's decided this is how the character thinks in their head in this accent. So it's all the way through, and it's using like Scottish sorry, my brain's so not working, slang as well, and just really unique phrases, just it's all the way through, and it absolutely did my head in because it's to the point where you're just like, I don't know what's happening. I just want to hear how this book, I just want to read this story. I don't want to kind of wade through this artifice that's been put on it.
Can I ask, is the content of that story, what is it, what kind of genre is it? And what kind
It's a fantasy. So it's a fantasy that I guess is drawing upon,
Scottish
Celtic history. And so that's the fantasy and the magic. So I think that's the justification for the accent. But then I guess it's just, it's very much at the forefront.
I think that's something that Phoenix touched on once about reader fatigue. That's something you got to be careful with.
Yes. Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
It sounds a lot like, reminds me of Irvin Welsh's Train Spotting, which everyone might know was turned into the film. That's written from top to bottom in the, I don't think it's Cockney, but I think it's a very thick British kind of jargon dialogue. But then I think that way of writing that story fitted the context of the story, because it was about their lives in the inner city and getting into drug addiction. So an awful lot of it was the kind of ugly poetry of the city. But at the same time, I remember trying to read that when I was a teenager and getting that kind of fatigue of finding it rather inaccessible. I remember finding it very cool, but I couldn't sit down and read it for long periods of time.
Small bites.
Ended up getting replaced by slightly more accessible reading. And I actually felt the same thing with Prophet Song, which is written by an Irish author, Paul Lynch here, and it unanimously won the Booker Prize the year that it came out. Which is kind of a story of Ireland kind of slipping into totalitarian rule. Content was brilliant, but it's sort of written in this stream of consciousness. No quotation marks for dialogue, no paragraph breaks, so it's just block of words.
Very Virginia Woolf of him.
Yeah. And it almost feels kind of oppressive, like you feel like everything's closing in on the characters. But again, I found I got quite fatigued reading it, and I felt my progress was significantly slower than reading another book. So I ended up not finishing it because of that. Whereas I quite love that style of writing. It's quite popular. Kevin Barry, another Irish writer, does it. Sally Rooney does that stream of consciousness thing very well, and I typically love it. But I just found it kind of inaccessible when Paul Lynch did it. Has anyone ever come across any tips or tricks or advice on doing those styles of writing and trying to lessen the reader fatigue or making it a little bit more accessible? Or if it's something that someone wants to do, is there certain approaches that they should?
I once read an essay saying that to convince people about a subject, you have to make them feel as if you agree on everything else, if that makes sense. So
agree on everything else.
So to convince someone that one thing they believe is wrong, you got to give them the feeling that on most other topics, you two actually agree. And I think that can almost be taken risk with writing. If you take a massive risk with your writing, a lot of the other things should theoretically make your reader feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Let's say that you've decided to write a swashbuckling pirate story using only the pronoun you instead of I. A lot of the other things would have to be familiar to the reader, I think, so that they would have time to like get used to this. Okay, this is all you, but it's still a classic pirate story with A, B, C, and D, and what I'd expect. A good example in a film is actually the first Avatar, not the Airbender, but the Cameron version. Is that you've got this movie that is presented in 3D, which was this crazy change in form. People were not used to seeing movies in 3D, but if you look at the story itself, it's quite comfortable and safe and familiar. There's nothing in it that is, breaking conventions. So if you are taking a massive risk to content or form, I would say watch how you do the other things and how the other things can make your reader feel comfortable, familiar, safe, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's
absolutely.
really good advice. Save the Cat kind of preaches something similar, doesn't it? Like the mumbo jumbo rule. Like you get one.
Yeah, I like that.
You get one ask of your audience, one suspension of disbelief. And I
One
think
ass ball.
not even with content, but I think with form as well. If you're going to take one risk with form, I think that's really good advice, Matan, that everything else should be nice and predictable. So if you're asking your audience to concentrate so much that they might get a little bit of fatigue, everything else should be fairly easy to process. My other advice would be, it's the most basic advice ever, but sometimes short stories and novellas are your best friend when you are taking those kinds of risks. Maybe they don't often belong into a full-length novel. Sometimes one of these ideas can be explored perfectly and powerfully in the shorter form before your audience gets fatigued. And an example I can think of, I won't name drop it because I'm about to say that it's not good at it, but it's a book that is essentially written from the point of view of COVID, like literally from the microbes itself. Yeah, so it's like the air is the narrator. It's the particles is the narrator voice.
Oh, wow.
And that was really cool for like chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. By chapter 4, I kind of wanted to kill myself. And that book is like a did not finish because it was just, I kind of appreciate the technique from what it is, and I appreciate the technique from afar, but I didn't want to keep remaining in that narrative voice. There's only so often that I could be like drawn in someone's nose and down the esophagus and thinking about how I was going to like multiply and hope that my host would live. Like, again, fascinating if it was a short story or a novella.
Or a poem. Maybe a poem.
Or a poem, but it was attempted for a full-length novel, and I'm like, I can't do this. So it was, yeah, that would probably be my advice. What a very excellent and fascinating idea. Like it both got you two sitting forward and being like, what a concept. But yeah, for a full length is punishing.
Yeah. I think that's a good point about length, because an awful lot of what we would think of as very maybe not groundbreaking, but very influential sci-fi films were almost always short stories or very short novellas that had kind of like big concept stuff. But they were these short punchy stories that explored the concept, didn't have to draw it out over a whole novel. Certain ideas and certain genres, definitely short stories could be the way to go. And yeah, just what you were saying, like about getting one odd thing, or one mumbo jumbo, probably with stuff like you were discussing with that style of writing where it was all done in the accent of the character. Like I think that worked in Trainspotting because the city was so familiar and kind of made a lot of sense. Kevin Barry has a book called Nightboat to Tangier, which is a kind of an Irish crime novel, but it's written in very, very, very colloquial, difficult to follow Irish sentences. But he has formatted it so that it's every piece of dialogue has a space after it, and then every paragraph is very short, and sometimes the lines they just exist by themselves. So it almost reads like a book of poems. But some people might say that's just an excuse to turn a short story into a longer book. But I personally loved it. I thought it worked really well, and I felt that if it had been written the other way, it would have been too dense. I would have been stopping to try to be like, what does this mean? Because it's very, very colloquial, and
Your
it
point
drifts
about
into a
train
sort of
spotting's yeah, sorry to interrupt. Yeah, no, that made it click for me why I probably don't like Kate Forsyth's book because it's a fantasy. So not only am I trying to like get through this prose, but I'm trying to understand a brand new fantasy world with magic rules and everything. So I'm doing two
Yeah.
sets of learning, and so that's kind of compounded probably why I didn't like it. But yeah, with a familiar city, familiar
I,
I guess character journey concept in train spotting, then yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. That well
I
yeah,
articulated.
I just wanted to add that I think if you're going to break a convention, which is welcome, you should break convention. I think you first need to understand, we need to understand what are the benefits of the convention and why does it exist? What does the convention bring me? Realize what you're giving up. For example, by writing in a close third person, you can create tension and you can create the sense of unknowing and intimacy. Be really aware of not just what is the new thing that you are introducing, but what are the things that you are dismissing, that you are giving up, and how you can kind of compensate for that in different ways. Uh, that's something I think basically be aware of why the rules you're breaking have been put in place and why they're so popular. What made it so popular to write in the third person? What made it so popular to do the hero's journey? Know it well, and then I think you can break the rule from a more knowledgeable place.
yeah. I think that's a great point to take into account when it comes to structure as well. That if you've decided to break up a structure and tell a story a different way, it may not just be that this linear structure helps shape the story. It could also be that there's pacing, could also be like the pacing kind of plays a big part in it, and maybe the expectation and the dynamic of making a promise and delivering on the promise and building tension. That can also play into a role with how stories might be traditionally structured. That if you start pulling certain pieces out to reshape something and make it unpredictable, you might be messing up with the pacing in a big way that you don't realize at the same time. I've mentioned before, I loved the pacing of Every Dead Thing because it was an overall crime mystery. So the overall story had that pacing, but within that, it had a kind of two mini mysteries. But each of those mini mysteries were set up from the beginning. So by the time you got to the halfway point of the book, you'd resolved one of the smaller mysteries. 3/4 in, there's a kind of another resolution by the end point. So it also almost felt like the structure was just a weird kind of like a story within a story within a story, but paced out in such a way that it felt continuous, but then you locked off each mystery as it went, which is very different, particularly for a mystery. And you would think that when you resolve that first mystery at the midpoint, you're going to drop a lot of momentum out of the story. But at that point, it kind of kicks in. This is the main mystery of the story, and this is what's really happening, and it actually relights everything really well. It would have worked just as well as as two novels if they had decided to split it in two, although it would have been too short because it works it's almost that midpoint has this like almost like a cliffhanger that you'd end something on to jump into the next. So it just flows really well from one half of the book to the other. I wanted to ask you guys, I guess, about character and maybe about do you ever find that you have this same conflict, or you're asking yourselves these same questions when it comes to characters and how you're depicting characters in stories? I sometimes find myself that I might be being too subtle in the kind of characters that I'm writing, and that maybe I should lean in a little harder and be like, this is the bad character, this is what this character is doing. And sometimes I feel like, no, I should just let it play out and maybe let the reader get a feel for themselves, and maybe they will or maybe they won't view the character a certain way. But then I feel like I'm losing that. I guess maybe sometimes I'm losing a strong sense of protagonist antagonist because I'm trying to let it play out a little bit by itself. And sometimes I feel like if I leaned a little harder, it might be a stronger story. So do you guys ever feel you're wondering about things like that yourselves with your characters?
I just really quick, I wanted to touch on what you said, which is I think is a very, very good thing to deliberate on, because it's thin ice. Because you lean too far, you got cartoonish characters. You don't lean enough, maybe your characters are not interesting. So yeah, I think that this conflict that you have is something I have too. And I think that depending on the genre you write, that's how the balance kind of shifts. Because when you're writing for younger audiences, you kind of need to put a big black hat on the bad cowboy and, a sheriff star on the good cowboy, to make things simple. I mean, used to be that way. I don't know anymore. But when you're writing for a more mature audience or an audience that has seen a lot, I think they kind of hope you'd be a bit more subtle and interesting. But then again, too subtle can be boring. So I think you've raised a very good point, James.
I can moan for a second about this as well. So Majesty is my example of this. Azera as a character, the lead character in that, was essentially a reaction of me like reading all these young female protagonists in mainstream fantasy and kind of wondering why are all these protagonists giving me the shits? And then I've just poured all that frustration into a single character. I guess I wanted to make her anti-fan service. I think the things that were giving me the shits were these characters they're always very kind, they're always very smart, they're always right. They always love reading and they love books.
Hermione? Are you talking about Hermione?
No, I'm talking about every fantasy female protagonist.
I'm
all
sorry.
of them they all
felt like a personal attack on Hermione. I'm just saying.
No, they're all like this. Especially the book thing. You would have like a character who's like kick-ass with swords, and then they go to a library and they're like, oh, I love books. And it's very it's very fan service because obviously the person reading a book likes books, so they can be like, I like books too.
I'm like her.
And for me, it's like the lowest common denominator you can give a character is that they like books too. I'm like, try harder. So my exact knee-jerk reaction is Azera hates books, she hates reading, and she's actually dyslexic. So she hates going near words and public speaking. She's not always kind. She's not always intelligent. She's short-sighted and she's hot-headed, and basically everything society says a young woman shouldn't be is what I made Azera, and that was cathartic for me. But then I started giving this manuscript to beta readers, and no one likes her. No one likes Azera. So it's I mean, some people do. Some people know why, but they kind of want to like her more. They're like, if I'm going to go on this long journey with her, I need a bit more from her. So I know what I like about her. I kind of know that I like her despite her faults. She's very loyal. She will literally kill for people she loves. She keeps her promises. She's fierce, and I think she's actually quite at her core selfless. So I'm like, that. Look, there are positive. I haven't made her just this completely awful human being. So in my writing, so we're now talking craft, as an author, I have to work out how to strike that balance and get it right. My act of protest is putting all these like negative things on her quite deliberately, but then I do need to show the likability. I've got to give the reader something that they can latch onto and actually like her. And a book that was really eye-opening for me was the Poppy War books. Because I feel like, because I'd already started writing Majesty, I had a draft or two, and then I read the Poppy War, and I'm like, oh, this is an author trying to do something very similar. They have also written a hot-headed young female protagonist who is not very likable. And me as a reader, actually, again, I think I've talked about how famously I did not like the Poppy War trilogy, especially I liked book 1, but 2 and 3 were just, they were very painful for me to read. And it was because the protagonist was so awful. This is a character that was always disagreeable, always short-sighted, always making the wrong decision, always hurting everyone around her. So by the end of it, as a reader, I'm so fatigued. I'm so done with this protagonist. This protagonist has made me so mad. And I can see that the author had a similar intention as me. They wanted to do something different. They wanted to go against the tropes.
Yeah.
They wanted to take the risk, but for me as a reader, it did not succeed, and I had a bad time. So now I'm sitting back as an author being like, well, the reason Majesty's not done yet, the reason it's still in my bottom drawer, that I'm still going to keep working on it, is because I'm like, I want to succeed where I thought the Poppy War didn't succeed. I want to put these traits into Azura, but I also don't want to torture the audience the same way the Poppy War tortured me. So I don't have the answer yet. Maybe one day I will, but it is a challenge to get that right.
That's incredible. I think that's that's an incredible motivation to say, like, to be able to look at another piece of work and be like, I get what they're doing and I want to just go that little bit farther. That's a
Just
great
have a
story.
shelf of books that you don't like, put them in your writing space
when you're
and
like,
stare
I
at them
see what you're
angrily.
doing, I admire what you're doing. I just don't think you did it.
Yeah. I have it's almost off topic of taking risks, but it's almost the inverse of that, where I was writing a character that I really disliked based on something, and I was finding people weren't responding to it because the narration of the story was, isn't this such a terrible person? And I had to take a step back and say, like, how has this type of character been presented in media and in stories? And they're usually presented as you kind of root for them a little bit. So I realized like I had to reapproach this character and actually make them likable, even though I really didn't like them. Make them a little bit
Is it
funny.
the one I read,
make
James?
them dynamic. No, it's actually
because he was kind of likably unlikable too, in a way.
He was definitely likably unlikable. Yes, he was always meant to be that way, and he was quite easy to write. The character I'm actually talking about is Dennis from Cooling Engines. Who's a character I have kind of written in some larger work, but I originally had started off by writing his character as being very clearly unlikable from the go, and I kind of realized, like, if I approach him in different ways and make him a bit more of a character who's interesting for a reader to follow,
he was interesting
works
in
better.
You really succeeded there, because straight away I'm like, Dennis was great. I love Dennis.
Yeah,
well, what happened to Dennis?
That was an odd.
Yeah. Is Dennis the one that jumps into the van, or the one that is in the van while someone else jumps in?
Dennis is the one who jumps into the van.
Oh yeah, he's bad news. Sorry.
Yeah.
That guy.
That was an interesting thing for me to step back from that character and say, if I look at it, if I make him this way, people will like him. I hate him, but people will like him, and he'll work. Yeah.
I want to detach likability from morality for a second. I think that whether we like a character is not the same as where we would place that character on the moral compass. We can root for freaking Michael Corleone in The Godfather. He's not a good guy, okay? There's nothing good about the guy, but we will root for him. And we can also root for, the Oliver Twist, the orphan who's just asking for another bowl of soup. He's the good side of the moral compass. A few thefts here and there. My point is that I am of the mind that we have to like the character. We don't have to see them as good people, but we have to like them. We have to wish to see them succeed or be horrified by the tragedy of their failure. So we cannot be indifferent to their failure, and we need to be supportive of their success. It's okay to write a tragedy where the character fails and, like Oedipus eventually, spoilers for Oedipus, pokes out his own eyes after he realized that he slept with his mom and killed his dad. But we have to be horrified by it. If we're cheering for that the story has failed, if like, yeah, screw you, Oedipus, finally, then that means we failed. So I do think likability is not necessarily a stamp of you're a good guy or you're a bad person. So I do think we have to like the character, even if they're villainous. That's what I'm trying to say. Look no further than Ali's bird-themed protagonist. He is not a good guy at all, okay? He does very little that is objectively good. He's extremely likable. That's normal.
Yeah. I remember when I was reading it, he does a particular thing which is very unlikable, and over the next chapter or two, he is just so comical. He's so funny. Some of his lines are brilliant that I immediately forgave him when I was back on his side again.
You
didn't mean it. I can change you.
I thought that was very well done. Yeah.
Thank you so much for saying that, because that means a lot, and it was the exact beat I was hoping to hit with that character. The trick was to make him likable early on. The moment you're now talking about James, the really unlikable thing he does is now pretty much sitting at the midpoint of the book. And I think that's the right moment for the audience to go, oh, I'm now questioning liking you this first half.
I think we need a break.
And then the goal's to get the audience back on side by the time he gets his just desserts. So it's the tension of the universe punishing him and where the audience, likability of him is very. I put a lot of thought into trying to beat that out correctly and obviously land it. This moment you're talking about, James, also is probably a chapter I've rewritten the most in the entire thing because it's one I want to get right, because not only is the content sensitive and people will have guttural knee-jerk reactions to it, but it's it's just worth the attention, both as a craft-wise and content-wise, to try and get that right. So hopefully this book will exist and everyone else can have their opinion on that particular craft element, but it is just an interesting exercise if you do want to play with audience, when they like your character, when you don't want them to like your character. This whole idea of the morally grey character, it's the Walter White thing. It's you're still rooting for them even though you're like, absolutely, I am no longer sure I should be rooting for you. And that's quite an interesting audience tension, and to evoke that inside an audience.
Honestly, I think it's a trope where when in a TV show I see a character starts to become unlikable, I'm like, yeah, they're gonna kill him. They're trying to justify. They're trying to make us feel okay with the fact that they're gonna off him. So like, ooh, suddenly he's very rude. Ooh, suddenly he's doing things that we wouldn't want him to do. Yeah.
He deserves this at a universal level. Yeah.
Karma.
I might start to wrap it up there, guys, because we're running into just a bit over now. I think we've covered that subject from every angle, and a lot of really good insight there and good examples given. So listeners, if you enjoyed this podcast, definitely leave us a comment or follow us on sorry, what do we ask them to do at the end of the episode?
Stalk us, find us.
Find us.
Buy our book.
That's money.
My social security number is.
Or do we have is there a like?
Rate our podcast. Review our book on Goodreads.
Do internet something equals money. Yes, so if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a comment or rate the podcast. We'd love some feedback, and we'd love some ratings. So definitely do that, and follow us for more.
And we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Yeah. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Recording.
Best outro.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.